Okay, let's start now. Welcome to the Indonesia Project webinar. My name is Arianto Patunro and I am with Nurkamala Mulyani and Baskara Adiwena. Today we will discuss the tension between regulations and actions amidst the coronavirus pandemic. This is the fourth webinar in our series covering the COVID-19 outbreak. You can find the podcast of the previous 3 sessions on our website. And if you are interested in the future webinars, please check the schedules on that website as well. If you are in Indonesia, you can also check our activities via the Forum Kajian Pembangunan or Development Study Forum. We thank our sponsors, the Australian National University, and also the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Our guests today are Dr. Philips Vermonte, Ms. Bivitri Susanti, and Dr. Imelda Deinla. Philips Vermonte is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Jakarta. Bivitri Susanti, or BBIP, is a Deputy Director at the Jentera School of Law, Jakarta. And Imelda Deinla is a Fellow in the School of Regulation and Global Governance, or RegNet, at ANU, and also the director of the ANU Philippines project. Philips, Imelda, Bibip, thanks for accepting our invitations. So in today's talk, Philips will first look at the issue from the global perspectives, while Bibip and Deinla will then discuss cases from Indonesia and the Philippines, respectively. So let me now turn to Philips. Philips, time is yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Pak Arianto, Acho, and Nuka as well, and friends at the ANU for involving me in this. I'm asked to speak about the global aspect of this pandemic of COVID-19. And when we say global, of course, because the term itself indicates that it's a global phenomenon, that is pandemic. And because of that, I think what we need now, given the almost all countries across the globe were caught by surprise of this pandemic, COVID-19, and we seem to be unprepared to deal with it. We know that now the COVID-19 affect both advanced and developing countries, and no countries are immune to its detrimental effect to the public health security. And then that is why I think we need to review and we need to deepen international cooperation, especially in the health regulations. And then secondly, the magnitude of the effect of this pandemic, I think, has reached the extent to which now we know almost no country can do it alone, except probably Donald Trump. He thinks that he can do it alone. But, you know, for sure, all of these other countries, we know that we need to cooperate more. We need to mobilize international sources and cooperation in order to prevent from the next disastrous effect of any future pandemic from reoccurring. Now, there are at least 5 issues that I'd like to highlight. Number one, the current pandemic shows that countries with strong and as well weak health system almost equally vulnerable to the contagious effects of this COVID-19. And the sources of this vulnerability are domestic as well as international. And the 2 sources, domestic and international, are intertwined given the globalized nature of our world today. So there's this peril of globalization, the increased connectivity among peoples across the globe actually becomes the source of our vulnerability as well. So that's why I think the existing international framework for cooperation on the issue of global health needs to strongly address this aspect of connectivity between the 2 sources, the domestic and international. Now, one global level of framework for health issues that exists is actually the International Health Regulation, IHR. It was adopted in 2005, and the IHR has been the framework for the international community to benchmark and examine the national capacity, each of the national capacity in their readiness to prevent and so on. But the problem with this IHR is that it is non-binding. So a country has their national plan to implement the international health regulations. The WHO send the evaluation team and so on. But as we know, this kind of global framework sometimes is too big, and then you cannot enforce. You might get good results of the readiness of Indonesia at WHO for any pandemics and so on, but when it hit, it proven to be countries are not prepared. So that's number one. We need to re-examine this international health regulation. And number two, I think we also need to require all the members of WHO. I don't know if the US will still be in there, but we need to embed the framework into our surveillance within country and very disciplinedly cooperate and examine our readiness from time to time. And we have to find a way to change the nature of this non-legally binding set of regulation into something more enforceable mechanism. Secondly, I think there's another existing mechanism that is relevant. That is the Forum of Global Health Security Agenda that was established by some countries, including Indonesia. The specific purpose of this agenda, the Global Health Security Agenda, is actually to increase collaboration among countries to implement international health regulations. So they know they cannot do it alone, so they want to cooperate in order for these countries in the forum to achieve the set of standard that the international health regulation has been setting out. So there's actually this kind of coalition of the willing, so to speak, of countries that they actually wanted to improve their health system and so on and so forth. So we need to invest more on this kind of a coalition of the willing among countries, for example, in the Global Health Security Agenda. And other international organizations can also, I think, mainstream their works into this kind of agenda. I know for a fact that the World Bank, for example, has created an instrument called Health Security Financing Assessment Tool that help these countries in the global health security agenda, to find or to think about the resource to fund, the improvement of their health system. Now, number three, regional organizations needs to get on board on investing more on infrastructure, health infrastructure, capacity building, and the development of human resources. Now, in our part of the world, our organization, of course, is ASEAN. And this is what I need to say about ASEAN. That is, with this COVID-19, ASEAN, I have to say, is defenseless. There's no, and I think ASEAN now reached the dangerous level of becoming irrelevant regional organization. As we know, the governments, most of the governments in Southeast Asia has been slow in responding. Only one or two countries that was quick, but the rest, I think, is slow. And then the defenseless nature of ASEAN exacerbate the situation. We are lacking the leadership and visionary leaders in the region in Southeast Asia. And then as an organization, this is dangerous because, we are living in a time where all the challenges probably, it's human security in nature, disasters, pandemics, typhoon in the Philippines, on all these non-traditional security matters in our part of the world. And ASEAN seems to be unprepared to tackle this. And it always becomes an organization that only react, not prepare in dealing with this kind of issues. So we took, let's take one example. The ASEAN Ministerial Health Meeting ASEAN, the health minister meeting only took place on April 7th. That's kind of 3 months late, for us to tackle. And then the summit, the ASEAN summit took place on April 14th with the ASEAN +3 with South Korea, with the +3 South Korea, Japan, and China. So, we sense this lack of the sense of urgency, the sense of emergency, simply not there. And I think I've read analysis on the Philippines, on Malaysia, on other countries in ASEAN. The citizens kind of criticizing their government for not, transparent, for not being decisive, or sometimes too decisive. Imelda, I don't know whether you're gonna touch this issue on the Philippines and so on, but it seems to me that the policies in many of the Southeast Asian countries come with the vision of the stability of the government from the perspective of the government, and in many places it's more on the security lenses. It's not from the people's perspective or public health perspective and so on. And this is, I think, the danger. We need to find a nice balance between the two, because it's not about the trade-off between the two, but how can we achieve the two at the same time, because the nature of the problem is as such. You cannot have security measure without dealing with the economic aspect, for example. So then my last point is that visionary leadership is key. Countries who have been successful in dealing with this, we learn the lessons. We did some webinars as well on the lesson that we can learn from countries that are quite successful in dealing with this. Is always that the leadership, the vision of the leader is the key, be they at the national or regional or international level. And this is very important for the country to be responsive and prepared. And the vision includes the willingness and ability to mobilize multiple stakeholders, because this problem is multidimensional. It's not only state that is responsible, but also, I think, at least in the case of Indonesia, academics and scientists need to be engaged more, and think tank, NGOs, and one thing that seems to be still missing, although it starts to be seen, is the private sector involvement. And this multiple stakeholders perspective, I think we need the most at this time of COVID-19. I think for the introduction, I should stop there, Pak Acho. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Philips. That's a very nice overview at the global level. So now let's see how this translates into country level. So let me first call Bibip to give some overview on Indonesia response to this. You're still muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pak Acho. Very nice to see again Imelda and also Philips this time where we really have to work from home all the time. Already 1 month in Indonesia. Yesterday marks the 1 month of work from home, for at least for my office. So the case of Indonesia, I have 3 points to discuss in this opportunity. First of all, of course, to talk about tension between regulations and actions in Indonesia, I should start by pointing out the state of denial that the Indonesian government for quite long had, and it does have a significant impact to the regulations issued later on. And so one is the state of denial, just briefly on that, because this will help explain why then. Secondly, what I want to explore is the regulations issued so far. I will review it and show how quite chaotic the situation is at this moment. And then the third issue I want to address is actually my reflection on the actions or lack of action that the Indonesian government have until now. My first point about state of denial, I just want to tell you brief flow of how the Indonesian government actually claimed that there was, until early March, actually the Indonesian government claimed that Indonesia had no cases of infection whatsoever. Even after there were reports from tourists went to Bali from China and then from other countries, Indonesian government still claimed that there was no case whatsoever. In February, in the middle of February, even there was a report by Harvard University researchers saying that statistically it's impossible that Indonesia doesn't have any record of COVID-19. But in response to that report, Indonesia's health minister actually stated that it was quite insulting for the Indonesian government and totally dismissed the report. There were other occasions, and for many of us Indonesians, especially NGO activists and scholars, we made them as jokes, about how a number of ministers actually responded very in a very bad way of communicating how they actually see this issue, even until the end of February. Even in February 19th, when many countries were already imposing tough travel restrictions, President Joko Widodo still announced that he planned to offer discounts to attract tourists up to 30%. And then he actually announced that the government will pay so and so many millions of rupiah for social media influencers to attract tourists to come back to Indonesia. So this is really bad response. And again, I'm reviewing that responses to show that this kind of response resulted first in the fact that we don't have data. And we know all that in policy making, data is the most important thing to have. And not to mention valid data, valid and reliable data, not only data. So because for so long, Indonesian government was in the state of denial, when the government started to acknowledge that there was at the time one case, and then the second case, and then the third case, then they started to act. But then my second point is what the regulations that were issued in the beginning, I would say actually until now, are a little bit chaotic in terms of the way they connect to each other. Because I will review later on a number of regulations that Indonesian government already issued. For example, we do have, Indonesia has a law on health quarantine since 2018. And then Indonesia also already has a law on disaster management since 2007. So very long ago, we already had this law on disaster management, especially this is after the tsunami 2006. So in the disaster management, actually non-natural disaster category also acknowledges health issues such as COVID-19. But until 3 weeks ago, still the government didn't do anything in terms of giving regulatory framework for any kind of action. So in the beginning of March, a number of provinces and also regions and cities actually started to cry for help. What should we, because there's no clear instruction from the central government. Mind that Indonesia is a unitary state. So we don't have federal government that can react on their own and make decisions. We have quite strict unitary system where everything has to be under control of the central government and specifically the Ministry of Home Affairs. In addition to that, we also have quite very hierarchical regulatory system, which put the local regulations far under central regulations. So we have very strict hierarchy of law and regulations, starting from constitution and then national law and then government regulation, presidential regulation, and then local regulations. So very, very hierarchical. So this leaves very little room for local governments to actually react to protect the areas. But at the same time, the central government didn't have any clear regulatory framework to respond to this health issue until the beginning of March. Although again, we have the law already since 2 years ago and then also since 11 years ago. Still, there was nothing issued on this, except there was task force on COVID-19 formed by the government. But in terms of legality, actually the task force has very little legitimacy at that time. At that time, it couldn't, for example, change or reallocate budget, let alone the local government budget, even ministerial budgets. The task force of COVID-19 at the beginning of the formation couldn't do much on that. To cut the story short, finally, 2 weeks ago, the president issued 3 regulations. Number one is the government regulation, basically to outline what we call as massive social limitations, pembatasan sosial berskala besar. It's the government regulation basically under the law that I mentioned before, the law on the health quarantine. And then secondly, finally, the president issued a presidential decree number 11 of 2020 regarding the state of health emergency. And interestingly also, so this one is the health area, but as important as health area, the government on the same day also issued a government regulation in lieu of law number 1 of 2020 on the financial policy and stability of the state finance in response of the COVID-19 in one day. But then we talk about the fact that in reality, many people already locked themselves in the house. A number of offices already, have work from home mechanism and all that. So as a result, economy was already very heavily impacted. So there were already regulations on the measures to take to ease the credit for people who have credit from banks and all that. It was, I would say, at least 1 month late. Yeah, the day when the government issued the 3 regulations that I mentioned before. And then, interestingly, just a week after the government issued the presidential decree to declare the state of health emergency, the government issued the second presidential decree, this time to declare the state of disaster. How do you call it? Non-natural disaster that we are having now because of the COVID-19. So we actually have 2 tiers of responses One is the health issue, and the other one is in terms of disaster management. So what are the differences? The health quarantine law actually is led only by the Minister of Health. In reality, it's helped by the task force of COVID-19. But again, the government cannot do much with regard to other areas apart from health itself. The second presidential decree on the disaster is the presidential decree number 12 of 2020. The leading sector is the president himself, helped by the National Agency for Disaster Management, Badan Nasional Penanggulangan Bencana. So we have two types of responses, and this creates confusion, not only amongst the society, but even amongst the ministries and local government and other institutions. Especially later on, despite the fact that the health minister actually already issued ministerial regulation on how to deal with COVID-19, other ministries such as the Coordinating Ministry of Maritime and Investment issued a different type of regulation. And then Minister on the Industry issued a number of offices that are excluded to close their offices. There are many little things like that that I can, in this limited time, I cannot mention all. I just want to highlight the fact that there's no clear comment from the head of the government, from the president. So again, we have two schemes going on at this moment, and despite the fact that we have two schemes, the ministries also take their own responses. So the last point, my reflection on this situation is, first of all, as I already outlined before, it's clear that the government doesn't have, quick response, the capacity to actually react on this, and also because of the state of denial, they don't have data. Again, let alone reliable and valid data. Even until now, many NGOs and scholars actually question whether the data is reliable or not, because, for example, data from the province of Banten, the number of deaths in the province of Banten and in the province of Central Java are different with the number of deaths announced by the central government. And then also there was a report by international media pointing out the fact that there is an increase of deaths actually in Jakarta significantly. Although the central government always says, oh, we already only had so and so many number of deaths in Jakarta, but if we look at the number of people buried from the other unit of the Jakarta government, then we can see that there is quite significant increase. So again, we can question the data from the government. And then my second reflection is that having looked at the chaotic regulatory situation, I can see that the approach taken by the government in this situation is actually not compatible with the state of emergency, because state of emergency needs very clear, leadership, and in as And then in terms of the unitary state, for example, we always say in Indonesia that we really need to defend our unitary state, NKRI harga mati, and all that jargon, so that in my opinion, the government actually should give very clear framework on, for example, this if one province or one city only have, for example, so and so many number of hospitals, then they have to lock down the area, for example. But there's no kind of regulation on that, on that direction. Instead, what the government has done so far is they ask the local governments to actually propose to lock down their areas with very, very bureaucratic, I would say, bureaucratic data. They have to outline how many number of cases, and they have to outline whether they are ready or not to provide basic supply for the people in the area, and then quite many points that they have to submit as a proposal to the government to lock down the area. And we have stories from quite many cities and provinces that the Ministry of Health and the Task Force of COVID-19 actually rejected the proposal from a number of provinces. And then again, there's this fear of losing the investment and all that. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I would say that even despite the the web of regulations that I mentioned before, one can actually still not see clearly what is the policy from Indonesian government to really slow down the pandemic. Because if we talk about rapid tests, for example, there's no clear information how many have we done so far. We always see in the many websites, how many deaths and how many cases, but we don't have clear information on how many tests have been done so far, and in which areas, for example, even so that even the president himself a couple of days ago asked his own government a reliable data on that issue. So I guess this is where I should stop for to start the discussion on this issue. I hope we can talk about this more in the Q&A session. Thank you, Pak Achok.
Thank you so much, Bibip. That's very informative and depressing. So let's now see how these things are handled in the Philippines. So over to Imelda.
Okay, thank you, Ako, and really thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this very important discussion on COVID that is happening at the global level and also in Indonesia and the Philippines. So it's really an honor, and I hope to have this collaboration more. As I think it was stressed by Vermont, the necessity for cooperation, but also to learn from each other is actually very important in these kinds of crises. So as what, again, Vermont has said, the Philippines is no stranger to disasters and crises. The Philippines has been regularly buffeted by disasters, natural and man-made. But in the past 2 years, the Philippines actually had to deal with two disasters, the Marawi siege in 2017, and the most recent, the Tagaytay volcano eruption in January this year. And now the COVID-19 induced crisis that started to manifest on the 20th of January with the first death of a Chinese tourist. So in terms of my presentation, I would like to probably provide an overview of the current COVID situation in the Philippines, and then I'll discuss the approach that was taken by the government and then my reflections on that. Having said this, this is the first time in actually recent years that the Philippines has been severely affected by an epidemic. So somehow it has been spared by the SARS and the flu pandemic in 2009 and 2010. And there was actually some hope that somehow the country should be able to manage, if not perfectly, but well within its capacities and limitations in containing and mitigating the impact of COVID, honed from its past experiences in responding to outbreaks, as well as from its routine dealings with natural disasters. In fact, as I would not elaborate on that, I think the Philippines actually has one of the most comprehensive legislation and regulation when it comes to disaster mitigation, reduction, and management. As of April 16, 2020, unfortunately, the Philippines is leading the board among ASEAN countries in having the highest number of confirmed COVID cases. It recorded 5,660 cases, 362 deaths, and 435 recovered. So with very limited testing and contact tracing of sources, this is merely a small fraction of actual incidents of infection and transmission that was actually recently confirmed by a study of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, the government's independent think tank. So the Philippines also has one of the highest rates of deaths as a percentage of confirmed cases, as well as deaths of healthcare professionals, particularly of doctors, with a ratio of 1:7, or 1 in 7 deaths are recorded. The precariousness of Philippine situation is such that PIDS has warned in that study that unless at least 70% of infections are isolated and accompanied by aggressive mitigation measures, the country could experience catastrophic consequences. This risk forecast is actually confirmed as well by a Hong Kong-based study published in the Asia Nikkei that placed the Philippines at the bottom 20 with the lowest safety rankings. I think Indonesia placed above the Philippines in that sort of ranking. The Philippines' ongoing experience with COVID-19 highlights yet again the current method of governance under President Rodrigo Duterte, which is mostly based on command and control, as well as the use of threats, violence, and intimidation. This is what I call fear governance, which is somehow diametrically opposed to the tenets of good governance that we academics love to advocate. Never has the Philippines, since the post-EDSA democratic governments, been ruled with clenched fist, even without a formal declaration of martial law. By the way, he also threatens, President Duterte threatens to declare martial law almost regularly in his public speeches. But in fact, Duterte holds martial law powers over the whole of Mindanao as a result of the Islamist siege in 2017. There was also an attempt actually to declare a state of national emergency with broad powers to appropriate private properties and assets, if not for the resistance of the Senate of the Philippines. What has been passed instead is a state of national emergency to purposibly deal with COVID-19 known as Heal as One Act, passed on 24th of March that provides for stronger measures in dealing with the pandemic and its economic fallout, as well as giving the executive additional funds of over 200 billion and the power to allocate these resources. Prior to this declaration, however, the Philippines put a Luzon-wide enhanced community quarantine, quite a lockdown on all respects, on 17 March to last until 16 April, but later extended up to the end of April. The Philippines' enhanced community quarantine is one of the earliest and strictest lockdowns imposed in Asia. An interagency task force on emerging infectious diseases, or IATF, established that is responsible in crafting policy strategies such as the National Action Plan and guidelines, as well as the COVID-19 Task Force, which is responsible for operational command headed by the Department of National Defense, and the designation of a chief implementer of the task force, who is actually a former general, a former head of the chief of staff of the armed forces. So in many ways, the government has treated the COVID-19 as a war. So from the time government began to take COVID seriously, that was around the second week of March when local transmission became manifest. This is seen from the highly centralized command and control directives from the president himself and coursed through the various national agencies, particularly the Department of Health, Department of Interior and Local Government, the military, and police. So in many ways, we could see that actually the regular kind of mechanisms were actually bypassed with this declaration of the ECQ. And then later on, when the IATF was established, the military is to take charge, as seen from all the military men composition of the IATF, the COVID task force, and the implementer himself. So the question here is, how has this war been conducted so far? Against whom and how? And the answers to these are quite complex. So first of all, it is my opinion that the war was directed to the people primarily. The ECQ was meant for strict enforcement and compliance by individuals and private entities. Lockdown seems to be the only measure in the absence of or dearth of testing facilities, contact tracing, and medical facilities. It has also been directed actually against those who complain and criticize the actions or inaction of the government. The National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, has even sent notices of investigation to some netizens who expressed their dismay or criticisms. There was also an attempt, if not for a very wide public outcry, to investigate a well-performing mayor, Vico Soto, a young city mayor of Pasig, who has shown initiative and innovation in dealing with the issues faced by his constituents. The vice president herself, Leni Robredo, was also threatened to be investigated for her seeking assistance and donations in the face of scarcity of resources and equipment, especially for frontliners in public and private hospitals. Second, this command and control is actually characterized by vague commands, selective control, and poor coordination, which leads the public to question the broader strategy in dealing with the pandemic and the lack of leadership to steer the institutions to deliver effective services and rally a unified citizenry towards a common goal. The ambiguities in the regulation to lockdown was particularly apparent in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, and the communication of different contradictory messages to the LGUs and security, personnel, and even among government agencies. So somehow it's the same with Indonesia. And this has actually resulted in bottlenecks and choke points for the transport of frontliners and delivery of essential services. There have been actually many reports of different interpretations of what is permissible or not, and contradictory actions of LGUs resulting in isolating barangays from accessing basic services, as well as of banning cargoes of transport to different ports. So the main goal, apparently, of all the LGUs is just to lock down, and that's it. While at the same time, at some level, the government tries to show that it is in control. For example, in the way it responded to Mayor Soto's innovations. But it has basically allowed LGUs to deal on their own terms with their constituents with no adequate support. One mayor in the Visayas region lamented how national agencies have treated them, the local executives, merely through barks, meaning like a dog, and threats of suspension and filing of cases if they do not effectively function without understanding their context and limitations. Number 3, it is characterized by bureaucratic control, red tape, and transparency issues. So while the crisis demands quick action and the purpose of emergency regulations are to enable speedy actions, there have been rampant reports of slower procurement and distribution of much-needed face masks, PPEs, and other medical necessities. Controls on donations have also been put under further constraints, constraining the availability of this much-needed assistance. The high rate of medical doctor fatalities has also been blamed for inadequate and substandard protective equipment. In fact, these materials have been so scarce that private citizens and organizations have pooled efforts to manufacture products locally rather than rely on importation or government supplies. The Department of Health has been criticized for not stocking up on this equipment early on and for slow action in approving testing centers across the country, as well as slow approvals of testing kits developed by Filipino scientists. In fact, this has led one mayor in Manila to go ahead with the establishment of its testing center and use of testing kits, defying the DOH regulation and risking court action. So in terms of the transparency of reporting some cases, there are a lot of issues on this. Reports of order not to report in cases on public hospitals or public institutions have actually hugged the media, as well as reports of people who have died without being tested or where tests have not come out even after their deaths. Number 4, there is unequal enforcement of regulation. And this has eroded the trust and confidence of the people in the measures and in the institutions themselves, and thus led to some to defy quarantine, such as those on a group of urban poor who gathered to protest the lack of food assistance in their communities. VIP testing, meaning the rich and famous, the politicians, in the face of scarcity of testing kits, has been decried, as well as the giving of more compassionate treatment of a senator who, while testing positive of COVID, went to shop and accompany his wife to a hospital. And this is in contrast to how some ordinary citizens, including frontliners, have been treated at checkpoints and subjected to very harsh measures. Perhaps the most concrete evidence to how this command and control governance has dealt with the coronavirus is shown in the Senate resolution passed yesterday. So there is a lot of drama actually in the Philippines on a day-to-day basis. To call for the resignation of the Department of Health Secretary for these reasons, to quote, the failure of leadership, negligence, and lack of foresight in addressing the pandemic. The senators also added the Secretary's inefficiency in performing his mandate as Department of Health Secretary, resulting in poor planning, delayed response, lack of transparency, and misguided and flip-flopping policies and measures in addressing the COVID pandemic that endangered and continue to endanger the lives of our healthcare professionals, frontliners, and the Filipino people. This is the situation right now in the Philippines, and as of this moment, the president had actually rejected the calls of the senators for the secretary to step down. So meaning that he actually enjoys the trust and confidence of the president. So that is all. That is all in the meantime.
Thank you so much, Imelda. The similarities with Indonesia are striking. Sometimes I thought you were talking about Indonesia, not the Philippines. But of course, there are some differences. And then, in the interest of time, I will just leave that to Q&A session. So let's now take some questions. So for audience, there are about more than 100 audience, 100 people here. You can either use your raise hand feature, or you can also type your questions on the Q&A box. So any question? Okay, let's start with one question from Robbie Rosandi. Please identify yourself and also state who the question is asked to. Okay, go ahead, Robbie.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm Robbie Rosandi. I'm working for Mekong Institute in Thailand. I'm from Indonesia actually. I would like to ask for the first to the first speaker, Dr. Philip. First, I would like to explain what Thailand did actually in response with this COVID-19. For example, like Dr. Philip says that this ASEAN seems lack of sense of this crisis. I do agree with this statement because it seems each government in this regional, in this region, it seems that they just follow by themselves, and then it also indicate by the ASEAN Ministry of Health meeting only. The meeting is on this month, beginning of this month, and it considers to be too late. government in Thailand or in some Mekong countries is also they have their own policies, like for example limiting the people. Like for example in Thailand they have been they have regulation. I think from 2 months ago they try to limit the people who come to office by shift. By shift. For example, some people working only 3 days a week, and then another 50% people will be working for 2 days a week, and this is also for the next week, the next week after.
Is this still happening now, Robbie?
Yeah, sure. They have also lockdown policy from the but only at night. So people cannot going around from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. 6 hours in the night. So this is the situation here. Someone who try to go out without any reasons, they will be punished by the government. There are a lot of like checkpoints, some policies there, and if you try to violate this, they will fine you about $1,500 US. That's the condition here in Thailand. And the second one, I would like to ask about the collaboration about with the private sector, or even with the third sector like NGO or whatever organization, because this condition cannot be. This condition cannot be covered. Government cannot go alone during this condition, but I have an interesting case with regard to the letter from special staff of president, which has a company called Amarta, and they try to help, and they said many times, and he said many times that this is no cost at all, and they would like to try to help people especially in the village, by utilizing their employees in the village. Or they call it volunteer. But finally, the public response is very cruel. They try. This is okay. From the administration point of view, this may be wrong because they use the letterhead of the cabinet secretary, but at the end, the intention, the goal of this person, I see this is actually he has a good intention to help people in the village to be aware with this pandemic, but the way he did is very wrong, and finally he apologized for this.
Okay, Robbie.
What do you think about this?
Yes, okay, thank you. So maybe Philips, can you take this first? You're muted, Philips.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but it seems to me that Robbie was trying to say that different policies across Southeast Asia result in different outcome, and then what the Thailand government did, I think similar with the Indonesian government. We are grappling with the same question, whether or not this policy on the lockdown, social distancing can actually be really enforced, because there are many factors to be considered. For example, in the context of Indonesia and maybe with other countries as well, we have two parallel governance system when it comes to health. The centralized the central government and also health system is also in a way decentralized. The health agency in the region is under the local government authority, and then you have the Ministry of Health at the central level. So it's difficult to harmonize quickly this kind of a bureaucratic challenge in the context of Indonesia. I'm sure this is the same with Thailand and other countries in Southeast Asia. So governance is really a matter. And if I may also jump in to respond and to give my reflection on what Bivitri already said, you know, in my opinion, although our government is, in this case, is very slow in responding, but I think at the same time, Indonesia is also has also been in the learning curve in dealing with disasters. Since Bivitri mentioned about the law number 24 2007 on the natural disasters, with the establishment of the National Disaster Mitigation Agency, or BNPB. And since then, I think BNPB has been working, but it was set up to deal with natural disasters. Now, then when we are preparing for the natural disaster, there's no natural disaster occurred. So it's hard to switch, you know, the operation of the BNPB into dealing with this. And at the same time, we have the Ministry of Health. It's true that they have the authority to declare the quarantine and so on. But given the decentralized nature of the health system in Indonesia, the minister himself does not have authority over the local government. So that's why I think there's this confusion about the law being used by the president, for example. I think he was torn between implementing, using the law number 6, 2018 on regional quarantine, and law number 24 on 2007. You know, so the Kepres is mixed, you know, and in the end, you know, it's then it's very hard either way for the Minister of Health or to the head of BNPB, you know, to act quickly and swiftly. And then I think this is the real problem. Governance is not in place, either in Indonesia and probably in some other ASEAN countries, that make it difficult. Number two, I saw a question as well, Pak Acho, if I may,
yes.
on
the please.
About this data, you know, lack of data and so on. We do feel this, but on the, you know, on the reflection, maybe this is really the question of the lack of capacity to collect data, you know, on the government side. You know, probably they do have data, but it's all scattered. So because the institutional capacity to collect data, to compose, and to make it available to the public, I give them, you know, benefit of the doubt here, that it's not in the capacity, and they are not thinking about, you know, how to present data to the public. Not only in the issue of this COVID-19, you know, even in our election system, KPU, you know, researchers have been complaining all the time since a long time ago that data is not, you know, presentable, you know, for researchers. It's there, but then sometimes it's gone. It's not there anymore. You know, the election data of 2004, you might not find them on the website and so on and so forth. So this is the capacity problem, probably, as much as the unwillingness to be transparent. So we got caught up with the two factors, you know, happen at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Philips. Before I turn to Bibip and Imelda, I will also tell the other audience that there was the question that Philip was answering about data is from Pak Terry Hall, but also from Ibu Karina Purwo. So they asked about how the data is being handled and how the collection is being done in the Philippines and in Indonesia. So Imelda or Bibip, do you have anything to add to that response from Philips and also to this question about the data? Or Bibip first. Go ahead, Bibip.
Yeah, actually, my response is for the second question from Robbie. I don't want to discuss in detail about the case of the special staff of the president because the complexity is quite high. So, but my emphasis would be two things. First is that yes, it's a good intention, but he used actually the wrong approach. Yeah, that to use that letterhead of the palace to actually convey message about something related to his company or organization. I mean, many say it's non-profit, but still something related to in terms of good governance, and in terms of conflict of interest measures. Anything that is related to the organization of somebody in the government should not be communicated using any government ways of communication. That's one thing. But the second thing that I want to respond with regard to Robbie's second question is I think this is important, especially in the case of Indonesia and probably also in the Philippines, that the response from the citizens is actually quite amazing, I would say. So there are responses from NGOs, not only in terms of criticism that's until now still going on, but also in terms of actual, in caritative way, distributing food for people in need, buying some produce that cannot be distributed because of the pandemic situation and all that. Even a number of artists, they actually collected big amounts of money to help the government, to respond to this situation. So it's notably, it's really, the hope about civil society in terms of the COVID situation is actually going up again. Yeah, after there was, there are a number of reports on the civil society in Indonesia. And then another thing that I want to convey is also about not only the regulatory framework, but also the bureaucracy in Indonesia. Because what I forgot to mention, and I think this is very important, that my criticism against the chaotic regulation is that the Indonesian government still sees the bureaucracy as, business as usual, bureaucracy as usual. Let me give one example. This is very mind-boggling for me. For example, to be able to receive the result of the swab test, it can take now more than 2 weeks. For example, if I haven't had the test, but if I have a test, with government facility, the swab test, not the rapid one, then I will only receive the result for myself 2 weeks from now. So there were actually many cases. 2 of them are my friends, actually, already passed away. They received the result of the test after the burial, after they died. And so with anger, I asked the government, so what's going on? Why 2 weeks? I thought we have, let alone the very modern test that results in 3 or 5 hours. We at least, from what I heard, have the one that give results in 3 days. But why in 2 weeks one can only receive the test result? Apparently because there is this regulation from the Minister of Health that after the test is done, it has to go through the bureaucracy, even down to the Dinas Kesehatan, to the health unit of the local government, so that they approve to be given to the person who was tested. In the beginning, it was only around 7 to 10 days, but with the number of people tested, now it's more than 2 weeks. Especially going to the local governments, I mean people in the region. In Jakarta, it's shorter because of the geographic place, but for people in outside Java, for example, it can take more than 2 weeks. So my point is, I think the main problem in Indonesia is still that the bureaucracy is not adjusted according to the pandemic situation. So that's why the government seems very, very slow in responding to the situation. In my opinion, the bureaucracy has to be, changed as well, so it can respond more quickly to the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bibip. Imelda, over to you.
Just quickly, I think on the issue of on the point of the role of civil society in the Philippines, I would really say that it has really played a very big role in terms of using its regulatory capacity. Actually, I mean, it's an unstate kind of force that has actually nudged the government to perform and to deliver better. So in terms of the contributions of the civil society, it's it's everywhere actually. So from the delivery of donations, even innovative ways of manufacturing things like PPEs and things, they have done it, all of that. But at the same time, this is the point in time actually that the Philippines, since the last 3 years, the Filipino people have really become very much concerned about the country, and has shown that by really pushing the government hard, but also at the same time resisting initiatives that would actually undermine further the liberty and rights of people. So, and the example I gave actually was the pushback that the public actually had in terms of opposing the declaration of a martial law-like declaration in the Philippines, wherein Mr. Duterte, I think, based on reports that he intended to actually declare martial law and to take over private property. So that was actually resisted, and the way the civil society played a role in that was really, really huge. So I would not elaborate more on that, but I think one of the questions here was actually on transparency and data. So Philip said that maybe it is not intentional, maybe it's a question of capacity. But I think in the Philippines, there have been questions about issues of transparency that's been deliberate. In fact, as we are doing this, I just saw a news report that finally the Bureau of Jail and Management has finally confirmed the infections within the prison, the very congested prisons in the Philippines. And these reports had been going around in the social media for a long time. And so are those infections in other facilities, like, for example, the National Mental Hospital, and the cadavers not being taken care of. These were all reported in the social media. And that when they are actually reported, it's the time when the government actually, the agencies actually do something about it. So I want to give the agencies the benefit of the doubt, considering the limitations of the movement. But there were also really credible reports about deliberate efforts to suppress this information. And I hope, and again, it is the private citizens actually who are actually very strong in terms of exposing these issues and making sure that the government respond to that. In terms of data gathering, again, that is one part that actually in the beginning, the Philippines really has the Department of Health has actually very little information. They don't actually want to share information, but the civil society again played a big role in that. I think one of that was actually coming up with their own data. So when the public, when these the academics, institutes actually come up with the data, then it plays as a pressure kind of force for the government to actually come up with the data. So now it's actually like there is cooperation now between the academe and the Department of Health, also maybe to some extent. But I would say that that is one of the achievements of civil society to actually push the government to come up with better data by actually devising their own modelings. In fact, the modelings on how to flatten the curve, the transmission rate were actually started by people, independent work by the academe, and ultimately being shared with the Department of Health. So I hope that the collaboration would continue. And as Vermont has said, this is not the time to play politics. I think everyone has been affected, and from the government and opposition side. And I think it is this divide that actually still putting the wedge into full, cooperation among civil society, the academe, and all sides of the government and the political actors.
Thank you, Imelda. You mentioned that this is not time to play politics. I agree with that. And then there is a related question to that. I think I saw one question from Rizal Sidik there, especially asking about the Indonesian situation. So he's asking to BBN and Philips, data and institutional capacity aside, what is the political economy of COVID-19 at national level policymaking who are downplaying or allegedly downplaying the potential severity of COVID-19 and for what reasons? Philips?
Thank you, Rizal Sidik. He's trying to push me to say something about this. But I think the political economy side of this is the psyche of the Indonesian government in the beginning was really to think about it from the economic lens. That because it's slow coming to Indonesia, it's been happening in China and some countries in Europe, and no confirmed cases in Indonesia yet until at least February or March. Then it affects the psyche of the government. And then that's why I think they think through this economic lens. And not to mention, when SARS happened and MERS and others, previous pandemic, Indonesia was not really affected. So it's not really in the knowledge, system within the bureaucracy. Probably only certain agencies are concerned about this coming pandemic in January. But in general, the policymakers learning from what happened previously with SARS and so on, we are not really affected. So that's why I think they downplay. And secondly, of course, I would say because of the mood was on investment, on increasing tourism and so on. So probably people who have been thinking about how to improve investment, improve tourism, were probably the ones at that time who advised the president. But I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. So that I think my short response to Rizal Sidik. But then I think because of the pressure from the civil society as well, I would agree, and from local governments, the epicentrum is in Jakarta, of course. Then the local government in Jakarta has the interest in alerting the government, and as we know now that it was quickly spreading to Banten and West Java, they were impatient. The local government in Bekasi, in Depok, in Bogor, they were impatient about asking the central government to do more. And that's why I think the resultant of all these pressures made the government switch their thinking, although it's slow and it's still, I think, too moderate for any policies to have impact in flattening the curve or in cushioning the economic side of this.
Thanks, Philips. Before I turn to Bibip, let me remind the participants again, you can all raise your virtual hands if you want to ask questions, in addition to writing them on the Q&A box. There's also our friend in Singapore, Siwage Negara, asked a very difficult question. I don't think anyone can answer this. What is the time limit for 1 month, 2 months, or how many for lockdown or for implementing restriction? But let me go back to Bibip to answer. Maybe he has a response to that question that was answered by Philips, or any other question in the Q&A. Also, later, Imelda and Philips, if you want to respond to these questions, just after Bibip. So Bibip, over to you.
Yeah, actually, Philip already. Yeah. Now I'm on now. Actually, Philip already gave the answer, and my answer will be very similar to his answer. So I don't need to explore on that. Basically, let me approach this in terms of law. So it has different angle. Again, to me, it's in terms of regulation, and this is, I think, the situation now really describes the failure of regulatory capacity in Indonesia. Probably, I heard very similar stories in the Philippines as well. The political economy, Philips already responded, and I have the similar response that it's really, I think the government also has, well, first of all, I don't think we can really cluster the government into one. There are different, different opinions, different political stance within the government itself, and they until now issued ambiguous and also, I would say, a very slow response to the situation, exactly because there's this economic interest and of the government, and we know that our current government, Joko Widodo's government, is really into investment and economy. So having this pandemic itself is already, a big challenge for the president, who really wants to have economic growth. Even if we read the narrative from the omnibus law on the creation of jobs, we can see that the current government actually aims at having economic growth of up to 6%, for example. So this is really, really a big issue for the government. So that's why when they want to issue any kind of policies, then the economic situation, the investment, and all those economic issues came also to the table. So in the end of the day, this is what we have until now. And let me also emphasize that in the Indonesian situation, we will also face the Ramadan and the Idul Fitri, where many we also have we will have the spread of the COVID-19 into the regions in a very fast way. And again, the policy on that was also impacted by the fact that usually during this cultural celebration, there would be some economic values as well. So until now, the ban on going back to the villages and all that cultural habit is not issued by the government, and it already creates confusion and also worries among many Indonesians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bibip. Imelda, do you have anything to add?
I think just to say that I think really looking at the experience of Indonesia and of course comparing it with the Philippines, I think really a lot of similarities there. But the point also is that I think in terms of the role of those people or the government units in the periphery has really to be really looked into because I think the focus is really more on the center. Of course, in the Philippines, Manila is the epicenter, which has 62% of the infections. But I think it's really important to really look at the situations in the regions, and I think where especially they lack more facilities, they lack more resources, and I think it's really important that the government should really take account of this. At the same time, of course, the question of when to actually end the lockdown is actually a very, very complex issue. And as what Bivitri said, in the part of the government, that this is the strong rationale or a strong reason for their opening is the economic, but also, of course, in the case of the Philippines, I think more equally with the economics, I think the political salience, the political survival, I think, of some of the politicians also depend on this. So I hope that with that, the tension between the politics and the economics should actually give a good perspective to our policymakers, to government, to actually have to craft a sound balance, and that should be based on evidence and not just on the imperatives of political survival.
Thanks, Imelda. You just touched on the issue about coordination between central government and the leaders at the region. So probably I can ask Philips or Bipip to reflect on that also in the case of Indonesia. We have seen, and this is also related to some questions here at Q&A about, the fact that some regional leaders seem to be performing better and more responsive. So what's your reflection on this, Philips?
Right, I think there are for sure we need to do so many reflections after this, yeah. From different perspectives, and on the issue of local government and central government relations. Of course, we need to rethink about the authority of the central government as well as the authority of the local government. And something are decentralized too much, but something are centralized too much in the context of Indonesia. To give one example, the BNPB, the National Disaster Mitigation Agency, at the national level, and then at the same time we have the local agency for natural disaster mitigation. But actually the two have no relations. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that BNPB could instruct the local BPBD, because BPBD is under the local government authority. So then we need to rethink about it. It's in the law. I think we need to, and actually the reviewing process of the law number 24/2007 on natural disaster is going on. Now it's supposedly be discussed in this term of the parliament. And secondly, I think we also need to reflect on, and I think it's happening. It's been rarely, this is a different disaster that we are facing. The scientific aspect is really important. I think now the government really, really understand this. And we just started to have that Research Innovation Agency, BRIN, and then under the Ministry of Research and Technology. It just started, but then this happening. So, then it might quicken all this, strengthened relationship between bureaucracy, research institute, think tank, and universities, and so on. It's just started. Number three, if I may, lastly, I think we need to reflect on the role of civil society organization or NGOs in Indonesia. I'm all for the participation of NGOs in dealing with this, but you know, it's not something that NGOs can just go on the street help people. They are risking themselves, and they are risking of transferring the virus to, when they go home, to the family members, to the neighbors, and so on and so forth. The old Good Samaritan principle, you know, I think we need to rethink about it, because we without knowing, probably we are endangering other people, you know.
Right.
The first case of the politician who died in Indonesia, the PDIP politician, of COVID-19, he was spotted a week earlier or 10 days earlier, handing out face masks on the street. You know, we don't know how many people actually then got the virus from that kind of good intention activities, but you know, there's a risk. So NGOs now and the government also need to follow strict protocols and then establish really a good relationship so that the two understand each other. I think that's my last remarks on this.
On that issue, Philips, there is one person asking about the role of media. I love your CSIS commentaries. That's really good. But what do you think about the mainstream media and reporting this, or maybe helping to, you know, contribute to reduce this?
I think, again, because the scientific part of this COVID-19 is very important. So media also needs to learn how to report this. And you know, otherwise they might risk of causing more lax approach by the people, by the government. You know, I overheard, for example, this morning I was jogging, and there were some of this IRT. They were talking about, oh, I watch on TV. You know, the minister said that it's okay to go mudik, but then he read the statement from MUI. You know, the ulama said no, and then they were confused. So
Right.
I think the media really play a very important role. And about the CSIS commentaries, some of the questions that are asked here, I saw, actually has been discussed in CSIS commentaries on the economy, on the health, and on the scientific part. If you are interested in, just go to CSIS website and you can download all the more than 50s, but some of them are in Bahasa Indonesia, and only a small part of it in English. We are in the process of translating all, but
Thanks,
it will take
Philips.
time.
Bibip?
Yeah. I also saw a question on related to the regional leaders' response. There's a question from Handoko about who actually enforce the regulation in the regional level. So let me respond to this in two responses. First, about the regional leaders' response, I agree that we should actually appreciate the fact that some regional leaders actually responded much more quick than the central government. But the problem in Indonesia is that many actually brought that into the politics. So, for example, when we talk about the Jakarta governor, you know, Philips can talk about this probably more in the different discussion, that probably has big chance to go to the, you know, in the next, presidential election. Many then, you know, only take the discussion into that area instead of objectively see whether the Jakarta regional government actually responded in the better way than the central government or not. They talk more about the politics of it, that probably he's going into, you know, because he will run for the presidency in 4 years' time and things like that. But more importantly, I would actually respond to the question on the law enforcement. This is an important question because we talked earlier about strict protocol. The problem is how strict is the protocol? Because one thing for sure is to answer Handoko Susanti's question, who implements actually the local lockdown? The answer is the regional police or Satpol PP. For example, for regulation regarding, going in the motorbike, for example, more than one person, that would be the area for regional police. But I should also mention that in the law on the health quarantine, the 2018 law, it actually has criminal sanction that one can be sanctioned up to 1 year in jail or up to 100 million rupiah fine. For that kind of sanctioning, then it has to be brought by the national police. Now, so there is this criminal sanction as well. But I would like to take that more to the issue of what Imelda mentioned before about the case in the Philippines, about controlling government, that actually now using the situation of health emergency, many actually want to have stricter measure by not only asking people who go on the motorbike to do some push-ups, but to actually take the so this is we also, I think, have to address, because that would not be the ideal sanction in terms of health emergency, because then we will talk again about people who will, spread the virus in the jail, in the prison, because we know that Indonesia just released 30,000 prisoners, of course, with certain parameters, with certain criteria, because of the situation of, overcrowding in many prisons in Indonesia. Anecdotally, I heard from my friends that many actually want to have very strict measures, like probably we saw some videos from India where the police actually hit people in the mosque, who violated their lockdown. But the Indonesian NGOs actually also have already reminded the government that we should not go into too strict measures against the rule of law itself. Again, we do want to have strict protocol regarding this lockdown and massive social limitations, but we should not go as far as what Imelda also mentioned about the martial law, because President Joko Widodo already mentioned, luckily only mentioned, about the possibility to declare a civil emergency, exactly because of this push, to really lock down people in their houses. But this is not something that many Indonesians actually aspire to have. Thank you, Acho.
Thank you, Bibip. Unfortunately, our time is up now. I apologize to those whose questions are not directly answered, but I'm sure we already have touched on most of all those questions indirectly. And I thank all the speakers, Philips Vermonte, Imelda Deinla, Bivitri Susanti. Thank you so much for your sharing your time and knowledge with us. And I hope to see you again in the future webinars. And I hope everyone stays safe, and see you in the next opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.